Right, we've hit 10:30 according to my computer, so I expect one or two more people will join as we get started. But welcome to this session on mastering the art of hybrid learning for the new world of work. It's a fairly short session. Just to start off with, it's probably a good idea for us to define what we mean by hybrid learning. So I'll introduce you to my co-presenter, Patrick. Patrick, we've got a definition here, haven't we?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. In simple terms, what we're talking about is the live delivery of learning in both virtual and in-person environments. So in a hybrid session, you will be simultaneously running face-to-face or experiential in-person sessions and probably multiple groups online. So you are managing multiple conversations in one instance, and in whichever mode that you are working with, you are endeavoring to make sure that you are having a shared experience, a shared learning objective achieved.
Okay, so specifically today, that's what we think hybrid learning is, and we're going to learn about our model for hybrid learning design. We're also going to sort of cover hopefully a reasonable number of practical tips from sessions that we've run and experience that we've gained. We'll look at some of the technology and tools that are useful in enabling hybrid learning. And we'll also talk about some of the things that are possible and some of the things that may be quite difficult with hybrid learning. I'm Jeff Bloom. This quote from Henry Rollins is, "You need a little bit of insanity to do great things." So hybrid learning is interesting, I think, because it's something that some of us might have been doing before COVID. We've gone into COVID, we've done a lot of things around virtual learning. People are starting to get back together again. Some territories are coming back together, some aren't. And so we're constantly flipping and changing, and so sometimes the world feels a little the same. So I quite like that quote. Patrick?
I'm Patrick Thomas, and I quite like the Thomas Edison quote, just because I sort of figure that there's always going to be a better way. Perfection is going to get in the way of actually achieving success.
And we're learning, and it'd be great to see sort of questions you've got as well, because I'm sure you're learning and experimenting with this stuff as well. We probably ought to say who we are. We won't spend long on this because I know a lot of people who are on the call come to our sessions before, but Patrick, maybe you could just quickly say who we are. And...
Yep. So Leo is part of the Learning Technologies group. Within the group, there's a number of technology organizations that sit there on to the right, and Leo is on the side with the content and services side of things. And Jeff and I, and Ella, as a matter of fact, work within the strategy and design team, but Leo covers strategy, technology, architectures, content design, and how to deliver it.
And just as a quick clarification, so Ian Townley just said, you mean hybrid is live and virtual delivered at the same time? And that's how we're interpreting Ian, yes, so that's what this session's about. Some people also kind of conflate blended learning and hybrid learning, but we're talking about the idea that something's live and virtual.
So the idea of us being here together in the room, I'm here as a gate crasher to give you a sense of what the real experience is like, and then like you are joining virtually and contributing to the conversation.
Yeah. This is an area that seems to be a reasonably hot topic at the moment, obviously because of events. We had a session a couple of weeks ago where we polled the audience to find out what they were doing in the area. And we've got a little bit of intelligence on that. This was from about 80 people who responded, Patrick?
Yeah. So yes, we ran this survey and we wanted to ask them, so what's the experience with running hybrid? And we wanted to share these results with you just so that you could see where you sit alongside your peers. And so just over half have run a hybrid session, which we thought was interesting. And then just a little bit more than 75% so that they'd be running a hybrid event in the future. So what that was telling us was that we've got some newbies that are coming on, and we're getting prepped for a new session type that they were going to have to design and configure and run.
And there's some interesting things around the audience mix and audience size as well. So because hybrid is this idea of having people live in the room and people live online at the same time, it was quite interesting to me to see that if you had less than 20% of people in the room, or conceivably over 80% of people in the room, I kind of wonder whether hybrid's the right answer. But actually what was interesting was that a lot of people were saying there's going to be, for their audiences, there's going to be a mix of people up to about sort of 50% of people who might be in the room.
Yeah, and I think what we're talking about is creating an experience that's equivalent as good as for no matter where you're accessing or how you're accessing, rather than it being primarily designed for one audience and then a substitute experience for another.
Yeah, and the audience sizes, I mean, I think as good as, not necessarily identical, but definitely as good as. And the audience sizes that people that we're talking to are playing around with they're mostly between sort of 10 and 20 people, or between 20 and 50 people, and that makes sense. I think once you get to more than 50, which is a valid audience size, you may be more likely to be delivering something akin to a webinar. So this is obviously a webinar. We can't sort of simulate everything to do with hybrid, but we can give a couple of clues as to sort of things you might be able to deal with. So the use of the meeting owl, there are other camera and microphone combinations available. In the middle of the room is sort of one way of showing what's going on in the room, and of course there are other ways as well, things like external webcams, external microphones, and so on. How to think about it?
Yeah, so I guess why would you choose this as a mode for delivery? And it does make sense. Clearly, if you are working in an operation where you're going to have disparate teams that are coming together and you're going to have the virtual environment, so you've got to accommodate both. So that might be where it's dictated to you. Another way to look at it, it might be something that you choose when you've got the space is important, where you want to explore that the physical space with people in the room. And maybe the people that are virtual need to appreciate it, but they don't need to necessarily have the same sort of understanding. So what would be an example of that? Like,
so yeah, something like, I mean, if you were doing something like a new product launch and you had the product in the room and you wanted to show the product, that might be an example. Or if you're doing something like visual merchandising or something like that, where you wanted to show the space wherein you display the visual merchandise, then the room itself could be an important part of a hybrid event. I think realistically at the moment, we're seeing that most of the people that need this are needing it for expedient reasons. They've got people scattered around. They may have people who are working but self-isolating, things like that. It may be for cost reasons. But there are also, I think, some valid use cases where the different sort of virtual and live spaces that are available can be an interesting dimension and perhaps a slightly more imaginative, creative use of the space.
I want to pick up on Ella's point again, if I can, and that is the key to think about this is that you are delivering a shared experience versus separate experiences where you've got the physical, oh yeah, and I've got those virtual people that I've got to consider.
Well, yeah, one of the things I was going to just add to that as well is that we've got very used to delivering virtual experiences over the last 15, 18 months and prior for a lot of people. One of the things that we're finding quite intriguing is that the virtual experience can be a very, very strong experience these days, and remembering to bring back in the people in the room and really making sure the people in the room have an equivalent good experience is something that was slightly at odds with what we expected, I think.
Yeah.
So that's something we need to think about. But we said during this session we talk about process. This process is not particularly exciting in itself. We look at design, development, facilitating and production and tools and technology. If you design learning material, you'll go through these phases. But Patrick, it is interesting, isn't it?
You all know this model. This is not this. Looking at it on the surface, this is a model that you would all recognize. However, what is important in considering a hybrid course construction is that they are all deeply interconnected and not necessarily sequential. And what we would mean by that is you'd probably start with the tools and technology that you have available to you, and then let that inform your design. When you then think about your design, you have to also think about the sequencing, the planning, plan B and C that you've got to have in place, and move into facilitation. And so no more can you just rock up and deliver something on the expectation that you could wing it. In a hybrid session, you have to meticulously plan your plan Cs. And even come back to, as you are going into your develop phase and you're starting to sequence certain activities, you might need to redesign or even consider new technologies. So that's why we're saying in this model, they are all deeply interconnected.
I was going to challenge you on that and say you don't always start with the tools and technology, but often do, depending on the kind of event or experience that you're running. And I know we'll go on to that in a sec because Ian's asked a question about camera setup. But it's interesting how this last year has actually afforded us so much more in terms of you know, where we're at, because people are so comfortable with the technology now that we actually can afford to start pushing the boundaries in some instances with new kinds of technologies.
That's true, but I mean, I'll move on to talk about technology, because actually if you're producing a piece of e-learning, you probably know the authoring tool you're going to use, you probably know the LMS you're using, etc. I just want to come back to one thing you said, Patrick, and that was the way that this is also tightly interrelated. And actually for me, in terms of a design project, in learning design, we often follow a waterfall approach. We go through in sequence, we find learning outcomes, etc. And we move on to something that's fully defined. With hybrid, it feels much more agile. You're putting something together, you're testing it with the tools, etc. So within our model, we actually start with tools and tech. Because if you're doing it in the classroom, the tools are relatively straightforward. If you're doing it online, the tools are relatively straightforward. If you're doing both, the tools are, there's much more you can use, and also they can be much more interrelated. So for example, online tools that you can use in the classroom, you know, we've been using virtual classroom conferencing tools like the tool we're using today. Some of you I know have been using shared whiteboards or shared collaborative documents, things like Office 365 or Google Docs. We make a lot of use of polls, we make a lot of use of quizzes, we make a lot of use of chat and discussion capability. And we also use software spaces that specialists, so things like Trello boards and things like that. We've got an awful lot of stuff in our disposal online these days that people can collaborate in. So there's a lot of potential things that people may have or may not have, or that can go right or that can go wrong, that people know how to use or don't know how to use. And you know, it can be tempting to sort of play with all the toys and unfortunately not use them in a way that we already understand.
One of the things that's been transformational, I think, for me personally, is the whiteboarding tools like Miro and Mural, like having collaborative spaces that everyone can get involved, and particularly that people in a room and people who are like accessing virtually can, you know, can co-collaborate in a space has been transformational.
It has, and as Patrick was saying, we're kind of getting used to that, but when you bring the room back into play, and there's a question I noticed in the chat from Ian Carruthers asking what camera setup we've got. This is one option. I've worked in a number of environments with a number of different camera setups. Having, you know, room mics, wall mics, ceiling mics, and things like that. You can have some very sophisticated setups. This particular setup we've got is quite nice. It's quite portable. It's all in one device, as it happens. But it also determines a particular screen display. So, you know, pros and cons to different approaches. But things that will help in the room, and people in the room will probably be doing a lot of the same things as people online will need to be doing. So having an external webcam, it's much more important to be able to see the room and to have your computer webcam sort of pointing at my face. That doesn't tell you very much at all about the room. Use of things like boundary mics I've mentioned. The other thing that's very useful in the room is the idea that the learners bring their own devices. Might be tablets, might be mobile phones, might be laptops, because they're going to be doing some things that are the same as the people that are online are doing. They might be using a whiteboard, virtual whiteboard. They might be doing a quiz or a poll or a survey. And then the other thing is in the room, the people in the room need to get the same visibility of what's going on as the people online do. So large screens over to my right here, I've got a big screen. What I'm showing on the screen is a combination of things, including, you know, what's on the camera, what's on the chat, and you know, who's in the session, that kind of thing. But actually, if you've got a group of people in the room, and actually this is another point, think about what's going on in the room. Ella's very kindly just completely probably blown your ears by opening a can of Coke. And things like the refreshments in the room and interruptions that can affect the room that won't necessarily affect people online. You don't want a tea trolley coming in, clunking cutlery. You don't really want Ella opening her can of Coke just time speaking. But that's deliberately, obviously, to illustrate the point.
But even bathroom breaks, you have to think about how to coordinate that, because people that are going in virtually, they can just turn off, they can go mute, turn off their camera and do that. So it's making sure that the rustling and the rest of it that's happening live is kept to a minimum, and you're thinking about how to manage that as a facilitator.
And even things like breakout rooms, really important point actually. If you've got people virtually online, you can put them in a Zoom breakout room and you can call them back. You can time the room and close it and bring them back, that type of thing. If you're sending people, and you know, we all know this is the case because we all used to run these live events, down the corridor or up a floor, or you're sending them out to 3 or 4 different rooms, you've also got to try and manage the online session and somehow or other send them out and bring them back and not lose them on the way. So the design of the technology and what's going on in the room is increasingly important. So that's one of the reasons we start with the tools and technology. We need to know what everyone's got, whether they can access it, whether they can bring it to the room, whether they've got it online, whether they haven't. And partly because there's so many damn tools in the armory now, we need to decide on the ones that are going to work best for the participants and not give them cognitive overload where they're trying to learn how to use tools rather than get on with the learning activities. So needs to know it's going to work.
Yeah.
So design, Patrick.
Yeah, so we've already started talking about design and how the design is impacted by the tools that you use. I think we're going to keep coming back to this shared experience portion, and that it is as equivalent as possible because it might be different. Remember the basics. There's nothing in this that we wouldn't have told you when we're talking about regular workshop design or regular any kind of digital design. Think about your purpose, think about your outcomes, think about how you're going to measure that, think about that all up front in advance. But we've got a little model, and it's just there to challenge only, not saying that this is a truism all the time, but there's a model that we're playing with, which is this 40-20-40 model, which is about doing things where you have 40% as group. When you think about your design, it's 40% as group collaboration, and 20% is basically you getting the group settled, uploading potentially knowledge, doing that housekeeping, and then 40% as individual work. So we're actually saying that you should be making space, even within an event like this, where you're asking people to just go quiet and think about something, do something, consider, and that allows people to process in a way that we think is important.
I was just going to say, part of the benefit of this kind of hybrid session is you're not just getting the same people co-located, maybe in the same roles or working in the same buildings. You have that opportunity to bring together really diverse contributions and thinking. And so, yes, it's much harder to think in design about how we're going to get people to work together, but this is the opportunity of hybrid. It enables us to bring these people together in a way that we might not have been able to previously.
Yeah, and I was also going to say, gone are the days of just standing and delivering. Your subject matter experts that you would die, you end up dying from PowerPoint fatigue from them sitting up there and presenting. That's gone. In this model, you have to think about how can you get them recorded and put that up separately. Can you give that knowledge stuff separately somewhere else? Can you upload that to the LMS where you can track that? And then that people coming into the session have already reviewed some of the materials that you've created.
I think one of the things that's that's come out very strongly for me is there's a huge number of options, and you've got to narrow that down to something that works. And I just wanted to start off with sort of making sure that it's working for everybody present. So we talk about orchestrating collaboration. So if we're bringing together disparate groups of people, some of them joining online, some of them in the room, we've got to make sure that we know who's there, that they can use the tools and technology. So things like icebreakers can become much, much more important. So one of the things I've got on the screen at the moment is an icebreaker that serves multiple purposes. So it's a very simple activity. It's getting people to complete their name, sort of give 3 images that represent who they are and 3 words that represent who they are. It's quite a good icebreaker actually when you've got a distributed group, because it means that everybody can work independently and populate it, and people can see a picture emerging. You haven't got to do this thing where you go all the way around the room and get everybody to speak for 3 minutes for a start. But it also delivers a lot more for you as a facilitator. So for example, you can see who's turned up because they're putting their name into it. You can see people who know how to complete post-it notes. You can see people who know how to sort of drag images around. So things like that can say the people in the room are able to play, the people online are able to play. You also need to think about how to use the space available. And as we were saying earlier on, you need to look at how to make the experience the same or complementary. So you can work very, very hard to make sure that people have an identical experience, for example, by all playing in a whiteboard like this. But you can also, in a lot of learning events, think about different people doing different things. So if you're doing something of product, let's say you're running a session on product development, you might say somebody might look at product features, somebody might look at packaging, maybe the people in the room look at the packaging and you give them some sort of bits of paper and cardboard to play around with packaging. So you have different parts of the group contributing to the conversation and to the learning. So Creating a shared experience is important. Sometimes creating an identical experience is important. Sometimes a contributory experience is really useful.
And you can try to normalize that experience by doing some video shoot, for example, and consider things that would normally be done as a group. You could do as a video, like a car walk around. Think about sending out props in advance. Think about running pre-session surveys. You can see where people are before coming in. So there are different design ideas.
Yeah, definitely. We're throwing out quite a lot of ideas here. As I say, you've got to be conscious of cognitive overload and narrow it down to the things that matter in the session. Developing. I think the key thing with development is that you need to make sure that you're considering all sorts of options. We've got a question from Angus here, which she was saying that, managing the people in the room can be a real challenge. And so you've got to plan for a couple of versions of activities, because if things go wrong in the room, you need to make sure that people online are still able to play. You need to be realistic with timings. People in the room take longer to do things. They have to go away and come back. You need to also have backup hardware. In particular, you need to have enough facilitators and potentially a producer as well. We're getting quite used to juggling lots of different windows and lots of different screens.
I was going to say it's a really nice example actually of Angus's comment about having technology issues magnified. Having enough facilitators so that you've got people who can attend to and support different audience groups is incredibly important. And actually, we've got a question here: does someone have access to chat? When we've got our chat isn't functioning here, but we've got the team facilitating online who can then pass the questions so that we're able to keep the conversation going and understand, what people's questions are.
Yeah, and our colleague Alice is feeding through questions and things that we might be able to respond to given the time. So that's the good, very, very effective role of having somebody like a producer. You can see on the screen some of the things that matter here. If you've got a producer, it's also really useful to have a back channel to the producer. It might be chat, it might be something like WhatsApp. If somebody's lost their online link, they may not be able to use the chat because they may not be in the session. So having things like a WhatsApp group set up can be a useful back channel. And also think about what's happening to different parts of the audience if you've got a segmented audience. If Patrick and Ella and I suddenly get to leave the room because of a fire drill, Alice is going to suddenly have to get very familiar with this content. And also really, really important, recce and rehearse. If you haven't been into the office for a while, you're planning to run a hybrid session, make sure the equipment's there, make sure it's working, that type of thing.
Absolutely.
Can't tell enough, really, can
you? So we've already talked about the role of the producer, and so we think that role, though you probably haven't budgeted for it in this year, is going to be increasingly more expensive. So it's seen as a luxury these days. It's not. It's critical. So where you have a bigger event using multiple channels, you're going to need more than one facilitator. You're going to need a producer as well.
Which does beg the question, do you need to do hybrid? If you're just doing online, then obviously that is a cheaper option and can be a more manageable option similarly as we used to do, and we still do as face-to-face. I think,
different experience.
Different experience. But this corridor image is just to illustrate the challenges of what you might have to deal with. If you're trying to manage a group of in a breakout room, and you're maybe looking at what's going on your iPad, but you're also running up and down the corridor, you can imagine how quickly these things can completely get out of control. And as a deliverer, you need to be quite technologically literate. You don't have to use everything. Really, I advise you against using everything, but you do need to be able to sort of adapt and to use the tools that are in front of you. And the tools help quite a lot, actually. A lot of the tools, for example, things like Zoom, you can set things like session timers, you can do countdown timers, you can use the technology to bring people back into the room. So the technology can often help a lot. But live, you've got to remember all the logistics that you always used to have to deal with and try and do that at the same time as doing virtual.
Yeah.
Right. Execute and revise.
So you've done it. You've gone and you've facilitated the event and you've run it and that's it, right? Well, you're going to need to start looking at one of your measures for success. You also need to start thinking about, did you have to use your plan B? What happened that made that happen? Were people slower on the uptake on certain activities? Why? So it's in as much you're delivering it as going back and reviewing what you did throughout the session and try to improve that delivery mechanism. And maybe it's about onboarding people better. Maybe the technology wasn't right. You've got to explore another mode of delivery. But what we say is you've got to keep coming back and refining the plan. So it might, once you've delivered it once and you've had the jitters and you've had that, usually within the first part of the session, something goes wrong. Don't panic. It happens to everybody. But then think about what is it about the design or the technologies that I have that I've got to be able to change out and make it better for the participants next time.
And actually, Dave's asked a question that's highly relevant to this idea of executing and revising, and actually is part of what we relate to when we're talking about Agile, in that when we're designing an activity, we for something like hybrid and for something like virtual, actually, we'll typically have a team of at least 2 learning designers working on it, so they can try out ideas on each other, but also see what those ideas feel like through different devices. So, for example, if you've got a poll you might be running through a laptop, what does that feel like if somebody's accessing it through a phone? Is it better if everybody accesses it through a phone? So the trial and error element exists throughout design and development and delivery and, in fact, execution and revision. And people that are doing it well, we've been playing around with it for a while and we've learned a lot in the process. But there are certainly a lot of professional services companies who've often had to sort of manage people who are remote and in the room, are quite experienced at this. And actually any company that sort of has a lot of global distributed people will often have good experience in this area, and we've worked with some of those and we learn from each other in the process. So thanks very much for that question, Dan.
And Lyndon, you've got a question as well about what happens when you're in a world where you've got some resource challenges and you probably can't have an additional facilitator, you can't have a producer. What do you do in the absence of those? My suggestion would be simplify, because you don't want to kill yourself. You don't want to add the stress and pressure, which would be conveyed to the participants in the event. Stay true to the learning objective. What do you need people to do? Just simplify it.
And scale. I mean, smaller groups is something that's easier to manage if you're on your own.
Yeah, and I think to the uninitiated, certainly, we come across examples where, we'll be designing for a session of 30 and then suddenly, oh, we've had 150 signups, right? That's great. It doesn't having people joining virtually doesn't suddenly mean it's infinitely scalable. Obviously there is impact on design, so I think keeping it simple is really useful. But there's other things that you can do. So you could think about, keeping it simple, having at least a facilitator and a producer, bare minimum, and then you could look to say, if you know the groups that you're working with, you can look for volunteers, or you can look for champions in the room, people who are comfortable with technology, maybe who are used to delivering virtually or presenting. Those are the kinds of people who will be really good facilitators that you can employ as part of the session. And I'd also just think, in terms of the business case, giving people more access, improving outcomes, reaching more people, not having to people travel, all of those usual things. There's clearly a business case for, running these kinds of shorter hybrid sessions that actually, have greater impact and reach.
I think one of the things as well, I mean, I would always be very nervous about running this type of thing, which is so technologically dependent, with less than 2 people. Even if one of those people is a friendly person in the room. I just ran a session a few months ago with another colleague. It was to about 400 people, most of them who are based in the States. And my internet failed between minute 3 and minute 9. And fortunately, because I was with a co-presenter, my co-presenter just picked up that slot. I came back in. It wasn't totally seamless, but it was manageable.
Yeah.
And in that world, you're probably not just grabbing a facilitator that you normally work with and just having them join your session without having gone through the design and the activities and prep with them in detail, because something like that will happen.
And setting expectations with them and talking about what would happen if things go wrong. What happens if someone, steps on the Ethernet cable, or, or the internet goes down, whatever it is, you're, just talking that through so that everyone's prepared rather than just picking on them kind of in the moment.
I'm really conscious that we promised we'd do this in half an hour, and we have. There's a set of resources available that Alice will put links to in the chat, and we'll no doubt email you after the session. We've got some sessions on how to produce great looking videos that you might want to use with these sessions. We also look at some things called virtual archetypes, how people behave within the sessions, which we haven't had time to cover in the session. We've even managed to answer a couple of questions as we've gone. So as we kind of hit the half hour, sorry we've gone through this at a bit of pace. We know people like the half-hour session. If you've got any more questions to ask, then we'll try and pick them up in sort of 5 minutes after the session, but we also understand if people need to drop off, respect your time. There was a question from Liz Carruthers around capturing and evidencing completion on compliance activities. In a hybrid session, you can, of course, have resources that are sort of stored on a learning management system.
Yeah.
So people, something like a poll will capture information, something like a Kahoot quiz will capture information, but also some of the resources you might provide before, during, or after the session may well be stored in learning management systems. So there's all the tools that you used to have in your armory, still there. You just need to make sure you're not trying to use them all at once. And
I think there's also a real benefit to that, and actually, certainly some of the experience of people in like face-to-face sessions, it can feel really disconnected to the world of work. So actually using the same kind of tools and technology, having that kind of symbiotic kind of relationship through like a learning session and in the world of work, I think can be really useful, both for people in a room and outside.
And thanks very much everybody for joining. I noticed people are starting to drop off, completely understandably. Thank you very much for joining, and we'll just hang around for a few more minutes, and I'll just scroll back up the questions, see if there's any I haven't managed to answer.
And very much want to thank Alice Higgins, our producer, who's been online and helping us with porting the questions over into chat. Thank you very much. You've been an absolute joy and a sea of tranquility leading up to this.
And Dave Morton's got a question, if you're still here, Dave. Is there a gap in the market for offering hybrid learning at facilities commercially? We've done a few, so I guess that we've worked with clients to help them do that. I'm not sure how big the market is. It might be transitional.
We're really creating it now, but also I think the thinking here is often in design. There's so many tools and technologies and commercially available kind of offers, but what we're really seeing right now is it's about it's user-centered design, right? It's understanding audience needs, and it's about creating an experience that meets those, the intention of what we're trying to create, which I think we've kind of shown there's so many things available the art right now.
I've got one more question, if Pete's still here. I hope you are, Pete. So Pete Martin Smith, who's a colleague of ours, or an ex-colleague of ours, was asking how everyone should be equal in the sessions. I think everyone should be equivalent. I think that's a good way of describing. I don't think everything has to be identical. I think it's worth working hard to make things feel the same. But there is a possibility of people not feeling included. And therefore, I think it's important to design activities, and you're probably well aware of this, Pete, designing activities where people can play.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the kind of experience that we're seeing people experience when we're used to delivering in person, and then you're getting a poor experience like we're accessing virtually. I think designing with your whole audience in mind, designing for hybrid, is what really kind of flips that, and actually you get people connecting with each other and having a really powerful experience. It doesn't feel like a subpar, trying to be equivalent experience. It's actually just it's much more natural.
I think that's probably most of the questions we're going to get. We may not have been thorough in our answering of these questions. A question about the meeting out I think, I'm not sure I understand the question about the AI, but in terms of the reliability of the technology, we found it pretty good. I mean, I've had occasions where it's not been plugged in or something, the power dies.
That's user error.
User error, yeah, there's plenty of room for user error. It seems to have worked reasonably well in today's session. I mean, it does have its limitations, the layout is fixed.
Again, it's thinking through, I think, the experience. It can be really great here where we're in a group around a table, but otherwise it can be, if you're using lots of things on a screen, it can be helpful to have a camera placed near the screen so that participants in a room are looking at a screen and participants who are virtual are looking back. So it's just worth thinking through, I think, how you're running that session, and then what's going to be the the best setup and technology to support it.
And I think we might have missed a question actually from Vulcan Hauser around, do we have a recommendation or a program to do quizzes and polls? Lots and lots of options. We find quite a lot of our clients, and ourselves as well, have used Kahoot quite successfully for quizzes. And in terms of polls, quite a range of things. So Slido has a lot of pre-existing poll information. Zoom comes with existing poll templates. We've got our own software tools like Gomo that you can use to create things like quizzes and polls in. I mentioned Slido as another option. Padlet is another one. I think it's horses for courses. It's one of the key things is what's available within your organisation, what do you have licenses to use, what can learners access. It's really, really good if you can use it on the phone.
What are you doing with the data? If you want word clouds, for example, if you want to be able to share back, results.
Yeah, and things like SurveyMonkey, been around for years.
It's a really nice design technique to make sure that to send your quizzes or your polls to phones and have people pull out their phones. It just changes the dynamic when people reach for their phone and do the activity on their phone, even though they might have their computer in front of them.
Design sessions where people have actors and then they're voting on their phones and then seeing the impact of their decisions on the acting, and having that just in your hand is
it's really nice.
It's a really nice experience.
Got one more question, and I think we probably ought to wrap because people are starting to drop off in increasing numbers now. So, question from, is it Maeve O'Connor? I'm not sure how to pronounce your name. Maeve, apologies if I've got it wrong.
Maeve, yeah.
Do you use different pricing models for in-person participants? I think in terms of costs, and this obviously would affect your pricing. If you've got more than one facilitator, if you've got a producer, if you're using if you're using a room, you might need to rent that room, or it might be an overhead for your organizational costs. You might need to provide software. So I think in terms of determining your costs, the size of the session could affect that, facilities you're using could affect that. You might have some sort of greater administrative cost in terms of distributing recordings, distributing outcomes and that kind of thing. So I would say it does affect the pricing. How you choose to reflect that is down to yourself and your own organisation, I think.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for the question. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. And we look forward to hearing from you all again on the next one.
Yeah, and apologies if we didn't get to your question. I mean, Alice has been doing a great job feeding those through, but we're trying to sort of get to as much as we can in a short period of time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.